All right, you came back for part two of this lecture. Look at you all trying to get an A and stuff. Okay, here we go. So we're talking about research, and this time we're going to talk a little bit more about the process, the sort of larger process of answering questions and really what it means to be doing research. Okay, so when we're measuring attitudes, right, we're measuring attitudes, the book talks about multiple ways we measure attitudes, and I'm going to focus on really the only two that matter both in our class and really that are used in research. Truly the two types of those that they talk about that really get used in research. The first is Likert, and you all are very familiar with Likert questions because when you do what at the university we call SAIs, which are student assessments of instruction, those end of the year, what do you think of the class, your professor things, those are Likert scale questions, right? They give you a statement and then they ask you, right? And by the way, it needs to be an expression of a clear attitude. So my professor was well prepared for the class, sort of thing, right? In this case, maybe my persuasion professor is awesome, or I think everyone should take persuasion, right? Then you're asked to rate your level of agreement. Strongly disagree to strongly agree, you rate your level of agreement. So when you're writing a Likert question, you start with a statement. It's not a question, it's a statement. My persuasion professor is awesome, or maybe boring, right? I think everyone should take persuasion. And then you would say strongly agree, strongly disagree, right? That's how Likert. Then we get semantic differentials. So these use paired adjectives, and those pairs have to be polarized and ask you to rate on a scale. Where do you feel about, how do you feel about the thing I've asked you about? It's not clear. Right. So we ask you about something, and to rate it on a scale from 1 to 7, where on this end we have interesting, and the other end we have boring, right? And by the way, those are polarized adjectives, right? Interesting and boring and boring, right, are polarized, right? I wouldn't necessarily put on there interesting and slow. Those aren't really parallel ideas, right? Or I wouldn't have happy as the opposite of boring, because happy and boring are not the opposites of each other, but interesting and boring, or interesting and dull, we might say are the opposite of each other, right? The opposite of happy, of course, would be something like sad, right? So that's what you do. You give them two adjectives. They're these polar opposites, and they choose where they feel in between. Many times, but not always, these are sort of fill in the blank questions. So persuasion as a class is easy or hard, right? So persuasion is easy or hard, and then they rate themselves somewhere between. As the book says, this allows us to look at the intensity of the feeling. So do you feel persuasion is hard? So maybe you say, yeah, persuasion is hard. What I want to find out is, do you think it's sort of hard? Like it would be a 5? No, it's super hard. It's a 7, right? But that's what it does. So many times, but not always, semantic differentials are used as sort of a fill in the blank, which adjective best describes it, and we're able to find out how intensely they feel about that. And thus, we move into a section called About Research. When you're going to do research, and as you're looking at research articles, you're going to see the use of H's and RQ's. And H stands for hypothesis. And a hypothesis is something that makes a prediction. So researchers have gone, they've looked at past research, other articles, and based on that, they're making a certain prediction. So for instance, people will be more likely to comply when a message contains guilt, right? That's the prediction, that's a hypothesis. And the researcher is going to basically come back and say yes or no. And by yes or no, what I mean is, yes, I find support for that, or no, I don't find any support for it. Right? By the way, we find that's sort of true so long as it's done right, right? If you'll recall what the book says about that. So people will be more likely to comply when a message contains guilt. It's a prediction, right? It's not a question, it's a statement. And then as a researcher, you'll come back and say, yes, I found support for it, or no, I didn't find support for it. A prediction like 80% of people will comply with the use of a guilt appeal, that is not a hypothesis. That's not what we do. You'll notice in the statement I made, I'm going to write, there's word pair more likely. Hypothesis relies on words like more likely, less likely, right? And it can be many things, right? As guilt increases, compliance increases, or compliance decreases, or people are more or less likely to do something when blank happens. So that's the language we use. We don't talk about this sort of target of 80% of people will do something, but in a certain situation, are people more likely? Are they less likely? Are people who eat breakfast in the morning more likely or less likely to be anxious as they begin the day, to speed through traffic, right? Maybe no relationship there, and we'll find out yes or no whether or not that's true. Hypotheses are something that we do or that we use when, having read the literature, right, looking at past research, we are sort of guessing that we know what it is going to happen. That's what we use a hypothesis. Looking at past research, we just really think that we know what's going to happen. As opposed to a hypothesis, or in counterpoint to the hypothesis, we get an RQ, which is a research question. It's a research question, so it, asks a question. So as opposed to saying that, or making the statement, the prediction, how guilt will affect a message, we just say, how does guilt affect compliance? And we might find the answers are, it may be that it increases compliance, it decreases compliance, or in fact, it has no effect on compliance. And again, we find that guilt does generally increase compliance unless people recognize it's guilt, in which case it actually decreases compliance, right? But so that's what happens with the research question. We say, what is the relationship between these things? As opposed to saying it's going to increase compliance, we say, how does this thing affect the other one? We might find it increases, decreases, or doesn't affect it. Why would we use a research question, not a hypothesis? Because we went and we read the literature, right? We looked at past research, and it was not able to guide us and help us form a prediction for what it is that was going to happen next.